3 reasons why you don't have the life that you really want. It really boils down to these 3 things. Number 1, you haven't defined it. Number 2, you haven't identified the gap between where you are and the life that you really want. And then number 3, you haven't questioned why that gap exists. It really just boils down to those 3 things. So let's talk through those a little bit so you can start to analyze your own situation and see how you actually have all the power to create exactly what you want in your life once you understand what's got you stuck where you are right now. So number 1, you haven't defined it. So many of us in the veterinary world, we have worked our tails off to get into these professions. And now that we are here, we work and work and work, and the days just blur into each other, and we don't have any clear path. We don't actually know what's coming next. We aren't planning for what is next. So we just go and go. And it all starts out very innocently. For sure, we're all super excited about our careers. And as we dive into these new careers that we've worked so hard to join, then what happens is that we kind of let the other parts of our life fall away. And that's not bad. It's not a bad thing. We're not doing anything wrong because we're all in on our careers. But over time, some of the stresses of the careers starts to kind of build on to us. And because we haven't taken the time to step back and evaluate what we're doing, it's really common for us to get days and weeks and months and years down the road before we finally stop long enough to step back and take kind of an assessment of where we are. For many of us, what we find is that our lives aren't the way that we dreamed that they would be. But if we're honest with ourselves, we actually haven't taken time to consider what those dreams are for a really long time. But what we do often find in that moment is that what we have in front of us are things like not enough time with friends and family, maybe some expanding waistlines. That tends to happen to a lot of us. And also, we're not making the money that we thought we would make. So we tend to be still a little heavier, not as financially stable, and overall just not as fulfilled as we hoped that we would be. Now, not all is lost when we recognize this. So when you kind of come to that point where you wake up from your life for a minute, long enough to look around at what is there, and then you actually question, like, what is going on here? This is not the life I want. I want you to know that that's not a bad place to be. It's actually a really good place to be because it gives you the opportunity to evaluate and then to kind of change directions a little bit. Now, many of us think that the only way that we can create the lives that we want is to leave our jobs. And the reason that we think that is just because so much of our focus has been on that it must be the reason that we're unhappy. It must be the reason that we don't have the relationships we want, that we aren't as fit as we want to be, that we don't have as much money as we want to make. It must be because of the job, because that's where we focus our energy. And what I want to offer to you is that's not the case at all. There's actually a much easier way to go about getting the life that you want, but it starts with these 3 things. And the first one is you have to define it. So you have to give yourself the space to sit quietly and think about what is it that you really want for your life. Now, you did this once, way back before you went on your journey to become a veterinarian or veterinary technician. You had an idea of what you wanted, and you created a path for yourself. You went on a journey to figure out what you needed to do from an academic standpoint to get into the school that you needed to get into, to get the degree that you needed to earn, to get the job that you have now. So you have done this in the past. And back then, your focus was on whatever you needed to do to move that dream forward. Once you got there, you got the degree, you got into the job, and then you jumped into that life. Most of us become so, what's the word I'm looking for? We become so much a part of that. Like, it's not just a job, right? It's a lifestyle choice. We become so much involved in that we forget that there's other things, right? There's a lot other stuff that we want in our lives. And as we keep going and we get tired, then we start to wonder about it. Now, for some of us, the other time that we start to consider the other parts of our life is when the jobs that we're in is very frustrating. But either way, it doesn't really matter. When you get to the point that you're wondering about whether or not the life you have now is the one that you want for the long term, just know that is a great opportunity for you just to course correct, to really think about it and to define it again. This whole life of ours is a total journey. So decisions that you've made in the past are not the ones that have to keep you in the place that you are right now. I like to say that there's actually no bad mistakes. There's no bad decisions is the word I'm looking for. There aren't things that you've already done in the past, the decisions you've already made that are going to negatively impact what happens in the future. Because you always have choices and you always have opportunity to reimagine what comes next. But first off, in order to be able to do that, you have to give yourself the space and the time to just consider it. So step number 1 is to define what you want next. Now, does that mean that you're going to know exactly how to get there? No, heck no. You're going to have no idea how to get there. But just knowing that you want something different and allowing yourself the opportunity to consider what that might be is going to give you a lot of courage to move forward. And it's actually going to lift you up a little bit too, because you'll realize that where you are now is not all there is. And then step number 2, once you've identified what that is that you want in your life, what you want your life to look like, now you can identify the gap. What the gap is it's just that space between where you are now and what you really want for your life. And so there's all kinds of things that may fall into it. So you're going to want to ask yourself, what is it that you're believing about why your life is the way that it is right now? So for you, this may have something to do with your job. It may have something to do with your personal relationships. It might have something to do with your finances. It may have something to do with your past. It may have something to do with your family. It's probably a lot of all of those things. But to identify that gap, you need to ask yourself the question, why is your life the way that it is right now? And write down all the answers that you come up with, because you'll have a bunch of them. There'll be lots of things that you believe that have contributed to creating the life that you have right now, even if that's not the life that you want. So let's identify what that is. And that's what's called identifying the gap. Then once you've done that, you can step into step 3, which is to question it. I want you to look at all those things that you wrote down about why your life is the way that it is right now. And I want you to question every single one of those things. I want you to look at each of those statements and ask yourself, what if that's not true? Just offer yourself the opportunity to envision, what if it wasn't true? Just play around with that a little bit. If that's not true, then what? It's a great question to ask, and you'll be amazed with the answers that you'll come up with to that question. But once you identify that gap and you question that, the reason that you do that is because then it provides opportunity for you. It allows you to consider an alternative. Because for many of us, the things that we believe about why our life is the way that it is are things that we do have power to change. But until we even identify that, we don't know that. And for many of us, these things that we believe about why our lives are the way they are, we want to figure out why we believe them. There are lots of things that we believe, guys, just because somebody else believes them too, because that's something we've been told, it's something, the culture that's been created. And we know in vet med this is true, right? I mean, how many of you out there are just believing that you're destined to a life of being poor and stressed out all the time because you're in the veterinary profession?